They thought they could break you. They thought their tactics, their strategies, their carefully crafted illusions would be enough. But they never accounted for you. You are not like the others. You are not a product of their system, not bound by their expectations, not confined to their reality. They came prepared for resistance, for fear, for submission, but not for something they could not define, could not control, could not shake. You are the anomaly in their equation, the ghost in their machine, the variable they never saw coming. Every move they made, every shadow they cast, only reflected back at them. You did not bend, you did not break, and now the ones sent to dismantle you are the ones collapsing under the weight of their own illusions. This was never your war to fight. It was theirs to lose. And they did. So stand tall. Stand knowing that their power was never real to begin with. That their systems, their control, their authority, none of it was ever meant to hold you. You have outlasted their games, outlived their tactics, and now they are the ones haunted by the truth. Some people cannot be touched. Some forces cannot be undone. Some souls are simply beyond their reach, and you are one of them. An untamed force cannot be restrained. Every attempt to silence it only amplifies its resonance, reverberating through unseen channels. Their intricate methods, psychological warfare, veiled threats, calculated alienation, became the whetstone against which resilience was sharpened. They observed, expecting collapse, miscalculating entirely as something ancient stirred within. The blueprint of their control disintegrated before their eyes, not from rebellion as they understood it, but from a force impervious to their influence. Endless hours spent deciphering patterns yielded nothing but evidence of their own miscalculations. The fear they relied upon had no anchor, slipping through fingers desperate to tighten their grip. With every push, the dynamic inverted, the weight shifting onto those who sought to impose it. The unseen mechanisms they invoked began to turn against them, an irreversible loop trapping them within their own construct. And then, the inevitable, restless pacing, fragmented thoughts, abandoned directives. The system rejected its own components, purging what could no longer function. Sent to dismantle, they unraveled instead. No contingency plan accounted for an adversary who defied every established law. The game ceased to be theirs, and in the final act, the architect became the ruin. A fractured illusion is a mirror turned inward. The architects of deception, weaving intricate webs of distortion, found themselves ensnared in their own designs. Each false narrative, each whispered distortion, each subtle manipulation ricocheted in ways unforeseen. Their tactics hinged upon predictability, subtle erosion, gradual shifts, a carefully cultivated imbalance. But equations require constants, and when none were found, the entire system unraveled. The illusions they meticulously crafted did not distort perception, but shattered their own. The carefully scripted lies became tangled threads, looping back in endless recursion, turning their reality into a maze with no exit. No preparation could shield them from the backlash of their own making. They arrived armed with strategies honed over ages, yet against a presence that did not conform. Their weapons disassembled themselves. The expected responses never came. The anticipated fractures never formed. Their attempts to penetrate unguarded spaces only led them further into a chasm of their own design. The ground beneath them ceased to exist, every move tightening an unseen force around them. The breaking point was never external. It was the inevitable collapse of their own foundation. The abyss they constructed recognized no master, Conflict does not unfold on the surface, it transcends the material. Control depends on dissonance, a carefully orchestrated fragmentation of perception, an imposed reality designed to unmoor. Yet, there exist forces outside their spectrum, untouched by their influence, resonating beyond the limits of interference. Their impact is nullified before it even manifests, striking against something immovable. They expect resistance and encounter stillness. They weave distortions and meet an unshaken presence. It is neither defiance nor surrender. It is an absence, an unshaken force that cannot be drawn into their field of control. They push forward, unaware that their trajectory leads to collapse. The weight does not settle where they intend. The force does not diminish, but rebounds in magnified form. What they unleash returns to them, accelerating beyond any threshold they can withstand. The cracks emerge not where they projected, but within themselves. Their structures erode, their balance crumbles, and the system they built becomes an unrelenting force turning inward. The end does not come with confrontation. It arrives as their own unraveling, the inexorable consequence of an equation they themselves initiated. There are forces that do not falter, presences that do not diminish, and entities that do not bend under the weight of expectation. The objective had been meticulously crafted: infiltrate, destabilize, dismantle, each maneuver calculated, each response predicted. But what they encountered defied the confines of their framework. They had studied opposition, analyzed disruption, but nothing in their repertoire prepared them for this. Regardless of the scheme, manufactured disruptions, scripted distortions, unseen hands shifting events, none of it found purchase. Every carefully constructed plan unraveled, each effort dissolving into irrelevance as something unaccounted for loomed just beyond their reach. The cracks formed first in their methodology, subtle distortions manifesting in their assessments, their blueprints becoming erratic. The linear path of control contorted, and uncertainty seeped in like ink spreading through water. The pursuer no longer recognized the trail they once commanded. The psyche is not designed for endless pursuit. The mind that was meant to dictate found itself spiraling. The calculated force they once wielded had turned inward, gnawing at the edges of certainty. Was it a lapse in strategy, or had something imperceptible taken the reins? Unseen fluctuations corrupted the data, patterns refused to align, whispers of anomalies circulated among those once unwavering in conviction. The night became an unfamiliar expanse, consciousness invaded by visions that defied explanation. The mission consumed them, not as they had intended, but as an unraveling beyond their comprehension. Control is an illusion that disintegrates upon exposure. What had begun as a structured operation devolved into a frantic search for escape, a desperate attempt to undo whatever had been set in motion. The turning point arrived, not with revelation, but with surrender, a moment where perception fractured and no distinction remained between the orchestrator and the force they had disturbed. Departure was not a decision, it was inevitability. There was no battle, no opposition, only the realization that they had stumbled into something beyond dominion. The force they once answered to held no allegiance, no gratitude, no clemency, and in the final moments, it devoured its own without hesitation. Drop a comment. I endured what they could not. If an entire structure had been constructed to dismantle something only to find itself eroded instead, then they had entered with the arrogance of control, armed with deception, influence, and the gradual erosion of will. They were assured that persistence would break any mind. but they had never encountered something operating outside their spectrum. The moment their directive was issued, their foundation was compromised. They executed their strategies flawlessly, introducing distortion, cultivating instability, enforcing uncertainty, but their tools failed to penetrate. Every step had already been foreseen. Every method accounted for before it was deployed. They observed in real time as their approach faltered, while the force before them remained unchanged, impervious to the mechanisms that had subdued countless others before. Doubt was a slow poison, and it crept in without warning. The ones assigned to oversee control found themselves unmoored, their certainty dissolving. Their documentation became riddled with discrepancies. What should have been an expedited resolution extended into an indefinite stalemate. The patterns of psychological decay they expected did not emerge. Initially, they rationalized it as mere resistance, an anomaly within an otherwise predictable system. But as failure mounted, another thought took hold, silent and unwelcome. This was never within my grasp. The arrogance of strategy crumbled into the quiet dread of realization. The game had never belonged to them. Each move had been decided long before they even made it. Their belief in dominance was an illusion, a carefully crafted narrative built on control, deception, and psychological entrapment. They were conditioned to dismantle, trained to erode the very essence of those who stood before them, yet they never accounted for their own unraveling. But the forces that govern reality are not dictated by strategy or coercion. They move in accordance with principles unseen, mechanisms far beyond human design. Every ploy meant to destabilize became the catalyst for their own descent. The very framework they relied on to contain spiraled into disorder, mirroring their growing desperation. They surrounded themselves with networks of surveillance, only to become prisoners of their own paranoia. The illusions they meticulously constructed turned to dust before their eyes, exposing them to truths they were never prepared to confront. With each calculated move, they tightened the snare around themselves, unknowingly orchestrating their own collapse. This was never about exerting power over another. It was a test of what happens when those who thrive on control come face to face with something immutable. There was no countermeasure, no retaliation, just a force so indifferent to their manipulation that it left them dismantling their own foundation. They mistook silence for weakness, but silence was the very thing that undid them. Every deception unraveled, every certainty dissolved, and they found themselves adrift in a reality no longer bound by their influence. The system that once protected them withdrew, leaving them exposed to the full weight of the energy they had long weaponized. Their allegiance to darkness granted them nothing, no sanctuary, no recompense, only abandonment in the moment of their greatest need. And through it all, the ones they sought to break remained untouched not by defiance, but by the inevitable course of a law far older than their understanding. Balance does not waver. Consequence does not hesitate. The tide always returns. They constructed elaborate mechanisms of intrusion, technology, psychological infiltration, subtle distortions of reality, all in pursuit of control. Yet they failed to grasp the nature of the force they targeted. Their attempts to extract, distort, and repurpose energy were not acts of dominion, but of entanglement. The moment they chose their subject, they were bound to something beyond their comprehension. Their strategies were built upon the assumption that energy flows only in one direction, yet the currents they disturbed did not drain, they transmuted. Instead of siphoning, they became conduits. Instead of controlling, they were absorbed into something that reshaped them entirely. Their own thoughts, once sharpened weapons, became unstable echoes, reverberating against frequencies too vast for them to withstand. The proximity they sought, the influence they attempted to exert, became the very force that consumed them. Observation was their greatest mistake. To watch too closely was to be drawn into what they could not resist. They had no counter for a force that does not battle, that does not yield, that does not acknowledge their form of control. The chosen ones do not engage in conflict, they shift its very nature. What was meant to instill fear was purified. What was meant to unravel became clarity. And in the end, they were not the architects of destruction, but the victims of their own misguided intent. The tools they once wielded turned against them, and under the silent pressure of forces beyond their reach, they fractured. Not by force, but by the weight of their own choices. The weight of what they disturbed became unbearable, pressing against their mind like an ever-tightening coil. Sleep dissolved into a distant memory, their thoughts trapped in an endless cycle of interference and echoes of something not their own. The fabric of their reality warped at the edges. Familiar spaces no longer felt secure. The air carried whispers that weren't there before. At first, they ignored the signs, restless nights, fleeting distortions in their perception, a creeping sensation that they were no longer the ones in control. But paranoia is a hunger that feeds on itself, and soon, the walls they trusted became the very thing enclosing them. Their instruments of observation betrayed them. Screens flickered with static. Recordings captured unexplainable distortions. Patterns refused to align with logic. The world they had built, the certainty they relied on, bent under the weight of something they could neither define nor escape. Every attempt to rationalize their failures led them deeper into an abyss of their own creation. They had entered believing they were the architects of control, but the further they strayed, the more they realized they had become its captives. One by one, they unraveled, not through force, not through external pressure, but by the quiet disintegration of their own perception. Some faded from the field entirely, retreating into obscurity. Others clung to their purpose until the last thread of coherence slipped from their grasp. Their names, once written with authority, were now lost in the silence of their own undoing. If your heart overflows with God's blessings, now is the time to let that love shine. By clicking the Super Thank You button and giving $20 or more, you're not just supporting this platform. You're planting seeds of faith that will touch countless lives. Your generosity is a reflection of God's abundance, a gift that echoes beyond what you can see. Step into your purpose. Be a vessel of His grace. Give with faith, and watch His kingdom flourish through you. You were made for more. What began as a calculated operation turned into an unspoken enigma, an equation that refused to be solved. The ones they sought to dismantle remained undisturbed, while those who attempted to pull the strings found themselves ensnared. Their mission had been crafted with precision, built upon methods refined through years of unseen warfare, yet the ones they pursued stood beyond reach, untethered from the framework they had mastered. The longer the game continued, the more their own certainty corroded. Reports once filled with confidence became riddled with inconsistencies. Projections failed to align with reality. The chosen ones did not resist, did not fight back in ways expected, yet their very existence dismantled everything the system relied upon. The cracks formed slowly at first, but soon, the very foundation of control turned transparent, revealing the fragile illusion upon which their entire strategy had been built. Their control was never real. It existed only so long as they believed in it, only so long as their authority went unchallenged. But truth does not bow to institutions, and power is a mirage that fades under the weight of reality. The ones assigned to break what they did not understand became living proof of their own limitations. Their certainty turned to doubt, their strategies to irrelevance, their presence to nothingness. The system had no response, no adaptation, no recovery, for what they faced was beyond calculation, beyond human design. What they thought they could control had never been theirs to hold. The system's silent observers began to notice an anomaly, an assignment that contradicted every established principle of psychological influence. Those at the helm of control saw something that should not have been possible. Patterns emerged that defied all rational expectation. Certain operations were inexplicably abandoned. Certain individuals were quietly left untouched. Whispers spread among those who orchestrated these efforts, a realization settling in unspoken dread. The ones sent in did not return unscathed. They emerged fragmented, their certainty stripped away, their careers quietly erased. The vast mechanism that governed them, once thought to be unshakable, faced an undeniable truth. Some entities cannot be subdued. Some battles cannot be won. Some forces will not yield. They had approached with the cold detachment of tacticians, treating their targets as mere data points in an equation, minds to be infiltrated, perceptions to be molded. But the chosen ones are not patterns to be decoded. They exist outside the parameters of their comprehension. Every tactic deployed to destabilize instead turned into a portal, leading them deeper into an unknown force. At first, they dismissed the anomalies, coincidences, unexplained interference, minor miscalculations. But energy does not remain idle. It alters everything that engages with it. The deeper they immersed themselves in the process, the further they drifted from control, ensnared in something they could neither interpret nor escape. What was meant to erode became a tether, a link binding them to forces they were unprepared to confront. The very fabric of their thoughts became the battlefield, an unraveling they could not resist. Some shattered under the strain. The mind is not meant to process what it cannot contain, and theirs reached a breaking point. But the fear they had once wielded was no longer theirs to control. The world around them shifted, perception distorted, patterns dissolved, and the boundaries between seen and unseen blurred. They had crossed into something irreversible, no longer the ones observing, but the ones observed. Their presence in this field had rewritten something fundamental, altering their trajectory with no path back. Some fled, others faded into silence, their existence erased from the structure that once defined them. Yet a few did not fall. They transformed, forced into a reckoning they had never anticipated. Their training, their carefully cultivated detachment, all fell away in the face of something beyond protocol. The very institution that had forged them withdrew, abandoning them to their fate. But the truth did not vanish. They had spent their lives dismantling belief, only to become unwilling witnesses to what they once denied. Some disappeared into the shadows, unable to reconcile the reality they had glimpsed. But others changed. Those once tasked with destruction became silent seekers, forever marked by what they encountered. The chosen ones walked on, untouched, knowing that not all who arrived as adversaries could resist the transformation. Their empire had been built upon the certainty of control, on the belief that fear, pressure, and manipulation could dismantle even the most unshakable minds. But those who exist outside of structure do not fall to force. They had thrown every weapon at them: surveillance, deception, coercion, only to find themselves trapped in the unraveling of their own design. The more they attempted to infiltrate the unbreakable, the more their own reality dissolved beneath them. No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue that rises against you in judgment, you shall condemn. Isaiah 54:17. They built their house on sand, and when the storm came, it did not spare them. It was never the winds or the rain that undid them. It was the foundation itself, crumbling beneath their feet. They placed their faith in power, in control, in manipulation, believing they could outmaneuver what was never theirs to command. They mistook themselves for gods, but they were nothing more than men with borrowed time, standing in defiance of a force they could neither name nor withstand. But you are the unshakable. You are the one they whispered about. In rooms they thought were sealed, they studied you, tested you, ran every strategy, every formula, every play from their book of control, and still they could not move you. You did not rise to their bait. You did not stumble at their traps. They circled you like wolves, waiting for fear, waiting for surrender, but none ever came. You stood firm, and in your stillness, the weight of divine judgment gathered like a flood behind a dam, waiting for the appointed hour. And when that hour came, the flood did not hesitate. The moment they set themselves against you, they set themselves against something far greater than their own authority. They thought they were the ones watching, the ones pulling the strings, the ones dictating how this would unfold. But there was always another hand on the board, one they could not see, one they never accounted for. Every whisper, every plot, every shadowy move, they all came back to them in ways they could not escape. The house they built on control became their prison. The chains they forged for you wrapped around their own hands. The fear they sought to instill became the very thing that consumed them. What was meant to be a slow, calculated erosion of your strength became the unraveling of their own minds. They saw signs they could not explain, interference they could not predict, and failures they could not justify. Their carefully crafted plans dissolved. Their sense of control slipped like water through clenched fists, and one by one, they fell. Some broke in silence, retreating into the shadows, too ashamed to admit what they had witnessed. Others fought against the collapse, clawing at the remnants of their illusions, but the outcome was already sealed. The unseen forces that had watched in patience did not need to lift a hand. Justice is not loud, nor does it seek permission. It does not negotiate. It does not waver. It moves in silence, in certainty, in the unrelenting truth that no weapon forged against the chosen can ever truly strike. And so, when the dust settled and the storm passed, there you stood. Not as a warrior who had fought, not as a survivor who had scraped by, but as one who was never truly touched. The weight of their war did not mark you. The battle left no scars upon you. The struggle never belonged to you in the first place. They thought they were writing your ending. They never realized they were writing their own. They entered with certainty, armed with systems and strategies designed to shape the world in their image, only to watch their constructs disintegrate before them. Their understanding of power crumbled with each failed attempt to impose their will. Every effort to silence, distort, or erase became another undeniable confirmation of what they had refused to believe. Something greater moved beyond their grasp, something they could neither manipulate nor define. They sought to erase what they did not understand, yet in doing so, they became the evidence of their own irrelevance. The unseen shield that surrounded you was never accounted for in their calculations, never written in their manuals, never part of the reality they had been trained to enforce. And yet, it was the very thing that rendered them powerless. Their collapse was not a mere miscalculation. It was the proof that their dominion had never been real. They thought they could dismantle you, only to find themselves standing at the edge of a force they could not penetrate. What was meant to be your undoing became the revelation of their own limitations. The struggle had never belonged to you. Their war ended in silence, their control reduced to a fading echo, and in the void they left behind, your presence remained, a testament not just to endurance, but to the undeniable truth they could no longer ignore.